In 1324, a man walked out of West Africa with so much gold that he accidentally destroyed the economies of 3 continents. He wasn't conquering. He wasn't threatening. He was just going to Mecca. And by the time he came home, the damage would take 12 years to repair. His name was Mansa Musa, king of kings of the Mali Empire, and at the moment he set off on his pilgrimage, he was almost certainly the wealthiest human being who had ever lived. To understand what Musa had, you need to understand what Mali was. This wasn't some regional kingdom scratching at the edges of history. By the early 14th century, the Mali Empire controlled more than half of the world's gold supply. The Bambuck and Beret goldfields pumped out metal so reliably that European traders spoke of Mali the way we talk about Saudi Arabia today, a place of almost mythological wealth, somewhere beyond the horizon, where gold came out of the ground like rain. Musa ruled over roughly 400,000 square miles. He commanded armies in the tens of thousands. His court was stacked with scholars, poets, architects, and administrators. Mali wasn't a rich country pretending to be civilized. It was a civilized country that happened to sit on top of the world's most valuable resource. And in 1324, Musa decided to make the Hajj to Mecca, one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Simple enough. Except Mansa Musa didn't travel light. The caravan that left Niani that year was, by every account that survived, completely absurd. Somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 people. Thousands of soldiers, hundreds of camels, each carrying up to 300 pounds of gold dust. His personal herald walked ahead of him, carrying a staff of pure gold. His retinue was dressed in silk and Persian brocade. This wasn't a pilgrimage. It was a civilization moving across a continent. He passed through the Sahara, through the salt-trading cities of the north, and eventually arrived in Cairo, the most important commercial city in the Islamic world. Cairo welcomed him, and Musa, being a generous man and a devout Muslim, started giving. He gave to mosques. He gave to the poor. He gave to officials and merchants and strangers in the street. He gave because giving was righteous, because he was on a holy journey, and because he had so much gold that scarcity simply wasn't a concept that applied to him. In Cairo alone, he distributed so much metal that the local price of gold collapsed. The same thing happened in Medina, in Mecca, in every city along the route. Merchants who had spent decades building gold reserves suddenly found them worth a fraction of their value overnight. This is the part nobody talks about. Musa wasn't being reckless. He wasn't showing off. Or not only showing off, he genuinely didn't understand what he was doing to these markets, because to understand it, you'd need to grasp a basic law of economics. When supply floods a market faster than demand can absorb it, prices collapse. Musa had never had to think about that. He'd always been the supply. By the time he left the Hijaz and turned back toward Mali, the damage was done. Gold prices across North Africa and the Middle East had cratered by an estimated 25%. Trade routes recalibrated overnight. Merchants holding gold-backed inventory were suddenly underwater. Smaller economies that depended on stable gold valuations were wiped out entirely. The recovery took 12 years. And here's the twist. Musa figured out what he'd done. On his return journey, he approached Egyptian moneylenders and borrowed gold back at high interest, trying to reduce the supply he'd flooded into circulation and prop prices back up. It didn't fully work, but the attempt itself is extraordinary. This was a 14th century king deploying something that looks, in hindsight, almost like open market operations, contracting the money supply to fight inflation. 600 years before central banks existed, the people who paid the real price weren't kings or merchants with reserves to draw on. They were the craftsmen and traders in the cities along the route, whose entire livelihoods were priced in a currency that had just lost a quarter of its value in a season. They didn't get 12 years to recover, and they never knew why it happened. Behind all of it, behind the gold, the camels, the cathedrals Musa would later build in Timbuktu, were the workers and enslaved laborers whose extraction made the whole thing possible. Their labor was the foundation of every coin he gave away. Their names are in none of the chronicles. Musa came home and kept building. The Jingareba Mosque in Timbuktu, one of the great centers of Islamic scholarship in the medieval world. By every measure of legacy, his reign was extraordinary. But the gold story follows him, and it should, because it contains something true about how economies actually work. Wealth isn't just a number, it's a relationship. Value only exists in proportion to scarcity. The moment you release too much of anything into a system that isn't ready for it, you don't have abundance. You have collapse. We've run versions of this experiment many times since. Governments printing money to cover deficits. Central banks flooding markets with liquidity after crashes. It always feels generous in the moment. It always has a cost that someone else pays later. Mansa Musa was the richest person in human history. He was devout, generous, intelligent, and politically sophisticated. And he still crashed 3 economies by accident, just by being himself, moving through the world. So here's what I want to leave you with. At what point does having too much become something you're doing to everyone else, whether you mean to or not?